The sound of boots hitting concrete echoed across the training yard at Fort Benning. A perfect Georgia morning in 2003, sun climbing over the tree line, air still cool from the night before. Colonel Michael Sullivan watched the recruits complete their final lap, his steel blue eyes noting each stride, each labored breath. "Faster on that last stretch, Martinez," he called out. His voice carried the weight of 30 years of command. Not particularly loud, but impossible to ignore. At 62, Sullivan stood ramrod straight, his 6'2" frame barely showing the weight of decades in uniform. His silver hair was cropped military short face weathered by desert suns and mountain winds. Time had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but had done nothing to diminish his presence. The young recruits ran harder. They always did when Sullivan was watching. The colonel checked his Rolex Submariner, the one his Delta Force unit had presented him after Desert Storm in '91. A dozen scratches marked its face, each with its own story, none of which he ever told. The watch was 4 minutes fast, exactly as he preferred it. Sullivan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He frowned. Few people had this number, and fewer still would call during training hours. He stepped away from the track, boots crunching on gravel. "Sullivan," he answered, voice clipped. The voice on the other end belonged to Nancy Parker, principal of Lincoln High School. Sullivan's expression hardened as he listened. His daughter Sarah was involved in an incident. Nothing specific over the phone. "Come immediately," the principal requested. The colonel ended the call without ceremony, his mind already calculating logistics threat assessment. "Lieutenant Brooks," Sullivan called to his second in command. "Take over. Family emergency." The younger officer nodded, no questions asked. Sullivan had trained them well. 7 minutes later, his 1998 Ford F-150 roared out of Fort Benning's main gate, the aging pickup accelerating with unexpected power. Sullivan had rebuilt the engine himself, one of many restoration projects that filled his rare free time. As he drove, memories surfaced unbidden. Sarah at 12, the day she landed her first bullseye with his old service pistol. Sarah at 15, building a scale model of the D-Day landing for her history project. Sarah last week looking up from her physics textbook, Kate's smile briefly visible in their daughter's face. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. If someone had hurt his daughter, they would learn a painful lesson about consequences. Michael Sullivan had never intended to be a single father. Then again, he'd never intended for Kate to die of ovarian cancer 12 years ago, leaving him alone with their 5-year-old daughter. Life rarely consulted one's intentions. The wooden cabin-style house sat on 3 acres outside Columbus, Georgia, close enough to Fort Benning for his commute, far enough to give Sarah space to grow up away from the constant rhythm of military life. The front porch needed a fresh coat of paint, another project on his list. Inside, every room bore testimony to a life divided between duty to country and devotion to family. The living room walls displayed photographs of Sullivan in desert fatigues beside Humvees in Iraq, standing with his unit in Panama, receiving commendations for classified operations in Somalia. Beside them hung Sarah's academic certificates, her equestrian ribbons, and photographs of mother and daughter in happier times. Rex, the aging German shepherd that had once served as a military working dog before Sullivan adopted him, rose from his bed as the colonel entered. The dog's muzzle had gone gray, but his eyes remained alert, intelligent, like. "Not now, boy," Sullivan told the dog. "Sarah needs me." Sullivan's study was his sanctuary. Bookshelves lined 3 walls, military histories and biographies filling most shelves. A glass cabinet displayed his service weapons, meticulously maintained. The .45 Colt M1911 A1 his father had carried in Korea. Sullivan's own sidearm from Desert Storm. The specialized equipment from his Delta Force days remained locked in a hidden safe. Medals in shadow boxes, citations for valor, a folded American flag from Kate's funeral. And in the center, a large oak desk where Sullivan still planned operations, now educational rather than military. Every aspect of Sarah's life, from academic advancement to physical therapy, received the same meticulous attention he'd once given to extracting hostages from terrorist compounds. The colonel had sworn to Kate that their daughter would want for nothing. He had kept that promise despite the challenges neither of them could have foreseen. Lincoln High School had changed considerably since Sullivan's own teenage years. The brutalist concrete architecture remained, but metal detectors now stood at each entrance. Security cameras watched empty corridors. Even the American flag in front of the building seemed different, somehow its colors brighter, less weathered than the flags he'd grown up with. Sullivan parked the F-150 in a visitor spot, noting the late model BMW in the principal's reserve space. Principal Nancy Parker had been appointed 2 years ago, fresh from an education administration degree and minimal classroom experience. Sullivan had reserved judgment, as he did with all new commanding officers, waiting to see performance before forming an opinion. So far, she'd failed to impress. The school secretary recognized him immediately, standing straighter as he approached her desk. Sullivan had that effect on people. Combat readiness tended to become a permanent state of being after 3 decades. "Colonel Sullivan," she said, "they're expecting you in the conference room." Sullivan nodded. Principal Parker, your daughter, then," she hesitated. "The Harris family?" Sullivan's expression revealed nothing but internally pieces clicked into place. Jason Harris, Richard Harris's son. Of course. The conference room door opened to reveal 5 people seated around a rectangular table. Principal Parker stood as Sullivan entered, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. Sarah sat in her wheelchair, back straight, chin high, despite the red mark visible on her left cheek. Across from her sat Jason Harris, 17 varsity football star, his handsome face marred by a sneer that faltered slightly when Sullivan's gaze fell upon him. And at the table's end sat Richard Harris himself, expensive suit, an artificial tan, announcing his newfound status as Columbus's most successful real estate developer. His smile was genuine, revealing perfect teeth and genuine pleasure at the situation. "Michael," Harris said, extending his hand, "what a surprise to see you in this setting. So, domestic." Sullivan ignored the hand, turning instead to his daughter. "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine, Dad." The colonel placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, then focused his attention on Principal Parker. "Explain." Principal Parker cleared her throat, uncomfortable under the intensity of Sullivan's gaze. "There was an altercation in the cafeteria. According to witnesses, Jason made some unkind remarks about Sarah's condition, and she responded by dumping her lunch tray in his lap. After which," Sullivan continued, his eyes now boring into Jason, "he struck my daughter." The boy shifted uncomfortably. "It was just a tap. She overreacted." "The mark on her face suggests otherwise." Richard Harris leaned forward, his gold watch catching the fluorescent light. "Kids will be kids, Michael. Boys get rambunctious. Girls get emotional. No need to make a federal case out of teenage drama." Sullivan finally turned his full attention to Harris. The history between them filled the room like smoke, choking the air with unspoken accusations. "Richard," Sullivan said, the name itself sounding like an indictment, "I see civilian life continues to reward moral flexibility." Harris's smile tightened. "And I see retirement hasn't dulled that self-righteousness. Still fighting battles, Michael, or just reliving old ones." Principal Parker interjected. "Perhaps we should focus on resolving today's incident." "There's nothing to resolve," Sullivan stated. "Your student struck my daughter. That's assault." "Colonel Sullivan," Parker began, "while we take these matters seriously, Jason is our star quarterback. The championship game is next week. Surely we can find a reasonable compromise." Sarah spoke up, her voice steady. "He didn't just hit me, Ms. Parker. He said I should have died in the accident instead of ending up a useless cripple who's wasting a spot at West Point that should go to someone who can actually serve their country." The room fell silent. Sullivan's face revealed nothing, but those who knew him well would have recognized the dangerous stillnesses that preceded action. "Jason," Richard Harris said, a warning note in his voice. "Is this true?" The boy shrugged, defiant but unable to meet his father's eyes. "She thinks she's special because her dad's some big war hero. I just told her the truth. She can't hack West Point in a wheelchair." "Apologize," Harris demanded, suddenly conscious of the political implications. He was considering a Senate run. This kind of controversy wouldn't play well. "For what's saying what everyone's thinking." Jason stood up, towering over the table. "Her dad got her special treatment, same as he did when he tried to get me expelled last semester for a harmless prank." Sullivan remained perfectly still. "Placing pornographic images with my daughter's face photoshopped onto them throughout the school isn't a prank. It's harassment, which apparently continues with your institution's blessing." Principal Parker at least had the decency to look ashamed. "Those images were dealt with, Colonel. The incident was addressed." With a one-day suspension, Sullivan noted. Quite the deterrent. Richard Harris stood buttoning his jacket with manicured hands that had never seen real combat. Michael, we both know what this is really about. You've held a grudge since Baghdad. It's been 12 years. Move on. Sullivan's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. Baghdad was 12 years ago. This is about my daughter being assaulted today. Harris smiled thinly. Always the righteous warrior. But we're not in the desert anymore. This is my town now, my influence, my connections. He placed his hands on his son's shoulders. Jason will receive an appropriate punishment at home. 2-game suspension seems excessive. Wouldn't you agree, Principal Parker? Parker nodded quickly. Perhaps detention would suffice. We wouldn't want to jeopardize the team's championship chances. Sullivan looked at his daughter, 17 years old, brilliant mind, indomitable spirit, confined to a wheelchair because a drunk driver had crossed the median 2 years ago. He saw Kate in her eyes, the same determination, the same fire. Sarah, Sullivan said, let's go. She looked surprised. That's it? We're just leaving. Sullivan nodded. For now. Richard Harris smirked. Wisest decision you've made in years, Michael. Some battles aren't worth fighting. As Sullivan wheeled his daughter toward the door, he paused. Richard, do you remember what I told you in Baghdad when I caught you selling American weapons to insurgents? Harris's smile faltered slightly. Vague threats from another lifetime. Sullivan shook his head. Not a threat, a promise. Every action has consequences. You escaped them once. Don't assume you'll be as fortunate a second time. As the door closed behind them, Sarah looked up at her father. You're not just letting this go, are you? Sullivan's weathered face softened slightly. What's the first principle of asymmetric warfare? Sarah smiled. Choose the battlefield that maximizes your advantages and exploits your enemy's weaknesses. Exactly, Sullivan said. This isn't the battlefield. This is reconnaissance. The bullying campaign against Sarah Sullivan had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly, 9 months earlier. Like any good military operation, it started with intelligence gathering. Jason Harris and his followers had first mapped her routines, identified her vulnerabilities, assessed potential allies and threats. Phase 1 involved academic sabotage. Sarah's physics project mysteriously corrupted on the school server. Her locker combinations shared among the football team, allowing them to steal assignments and replace them with pornographic images. Her textbooks vanished days before exams. Phase 2 escalated to physical intimidation, blocking hallway access with her wheelchair, trapping her in the elevator by pressing all buttons before exiting. The incident where Jason and 2 teammates had pushed her wheelchair into the boys' bathroom and locked the door, leaving her trapped for 40 minutes until a janitor heard her calls. Phase 3, currently operational, involves systematic social isolation. Rumors about Sarah sleeping with teachers for grades. Social media accounts created in her name filled with racist and offensive content. Fake texts supposedly from Sarah sent to other students burning bridges with her few remaining friends. All of it calculated, coordinated, and carefully executed to stay just below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention. And overseen by a star quarterback whose father's donations had funded the new athletic field science lab and Principal Parker's generous salary bump. Michael Sullivan learned all this over 2 hours in his study, meticulously documenting each incident as Sarah finally unburdened herself. He asked few questions, letting her speak. His face remained impassive, but inside a cold fury built with each revelation. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Sullivan finally asked when she finished. Sarah looked down at her hands. I thought I could handle it. That's what you taught me, right? To be strong. Strength isn't facing everything alone. It's knowing when to call in reinforcements. Sullivan's voice softened. You're the bravest person I know, Sarah. But even Delta Force operates with support. She smiled slightly at that. I didn't want to be a burden. You already do so much. Sullivan knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. His calloused fingers engulfed her smaller ones. Listen to me. Nothing about you has ever been a burden. Not the wheelchair. Not this. You're my daughter. My mission. A tear slipped down Sarah's cheek. I'm sorry. No apologies necessary. Sullivan stood, military posture returning. Now we develop a counter strategy. Sarah wiped her eyes, squaring her shoulders. What's the plan, Colonel? For the first time that day, Sullivan smiled. Not the warm smile he reserved for his daughter's achievements. This was the smile his enemies had learned to fear, the one that preceded precisely calculated retribution. First intelligence verification, then strategic response. Sullivan moved to his desk, pulling out a notepad. I need names, everyone involved, their roles, their weaknesses. Frank Martinez had served with Sullivan in 3 combat zones. Now, as county sheriff, he maintained the same methodical approach to law enforcement that had kept them alive in Mogadishu. His office walls displayed photographs similar to Sullivan's, the 2 men often standing side by side in distant, dangerous places. Jesus Christ, Mike, Martinez said, reviewing the file Sullivan had compiled. This is systematic psychological warfare against a teenage girl. Sullivan stood at the window watching the parking lot of the sheriff's department. Orchestrated by Richard Harris's son. Not a coincidence. Martinez leaned back in his chair. Baghdad still casting shadows. This isn't about Baghdad, Sullivan insisted. This is about Sarah. Is it? Martinez closed the file. Because Richard Harris is announcing his Senate campaign next month. Rumor has it he's got backing from some serious players in Washington. Sullivan turned. What's your point, Frank? My point is that going after his son right now will look politically motivated, like you're trying to sabotage his campaign because of old grudges. I don't give a damn about his campaign. My daughter is being tormented. Martinez nodded. I believe you, but perception matters, especially with Harris's connections. He hesitated. There's something else you should know. I pulled his military record. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. And most of it's been redacted, classified at levels even my office can't access. Martinez slid a thin folder across his desk. But I found this buried in an old case file. Sullivan opened the folder. Inside was a single after-action report from Operation Desert Storm detailing an ambush that had killed 3 American soldiers. The report was incomplete, key sections blacked out. But one name appeared repeatedly in the margins, Lieutenant Richard Harris Supply Corps. The ambush happened near a supply depot Harris managed, Martinez explained. Insurgents somehow knew exactly when the patrol would pass, had perfect intelligence on their route and armament. Sullivan's jaw tightened. He sold them the information along with the weapons. No proof. But 3 good men died because someone tipped off the enemy. Martinez took the folder back. Harris received a general discharge 6 months later. No official reason given. He should have faced a court-martial. Prison time. His father was a 2-star general with friends in the Pentagon. Martinez shrugged. You know how these things work? Sullivan stared at the folder. Those men had families, Frank. Wives. Children who grew up without fathers. I know. Martinez lowered his voice. Listen, Mike, be careful. Harris has friends in this department. In the courthouse. In the state house. If you move against his son, he'll use every connection to crush you. Sullivan stood straightening to his full height. He can try. Sarah Sullivan's bedroom reflected both her past and her aspirations. Equestrian ribbons from before the accident hung alongside academic awards. Bookshelves overflowed with advanced mathematics texts and military history volumes. A West Point pennant hung above her desk. Sullivan watched from the doorway as Sarah demonstrated what she'd learned from the school's security cameras. Using her computer science skills, she'd accessed the school's inadequately secured surveillance system. There's a blind spot in the cafeteria here, she explained, pointing to a diagram she'd created. And the cameras in the east hallway have been malfunctioning whenever incidents happen there. Sullivan nodded. Deliberate. Someone with administrative access is helping them. The athletic director, probably. He's Jason's uncle. Sarah pulled up another screen. I've mapped their usual harassment schedule. They're predictable. Mondays they mess with my locker. Wednesdays they block hallways. Fridays they create social media problems. Sullivan studied the pattern. Tactical analysis impressive. West Point would be lucky to have you. Sarah smiled briefly, then sobered. Dad, I intercepted text messages between Jason and his friends. They're planning something big for tomorrow. At Miller's Diner. Sullivan examined the screenshots she'd captured. The messages detailed a plan to confront Sarah at the diner where she often studied after school. 6 of them, including Jason, planning to teach the cripple a final lesson. They know I go there to study for AP Physics on Thursdays, Sarah explained. Mrs. Miller lets me use the corner booth for hours if I order a coffee and pie. Sullivan's expression hardened as he read the increasingly violent suggestions in the text chain. You're not going. I have to, Sarah countered. If I don't show, they'll just reschedule. This has to end, Dad. Sullivan recognized the determination in her eyes. Kate's determination. You're suggesting we use their plan against them. Sarah nodded. Set the ambush rather than walk into it. A strategy straight from his own playbook. Sullivan considered the risks, the variables, the potential outcomes. It's dangerous. So is letting this continue. Sarah's voice strengthened. You taught me that bullies don't stop until they face consequences. Real consequences. Sullivan studied his daughter, not just her mother's determination, but his tactical mind. A warrior trapped in a broken body refusing to surrender. We'll need evidence, Sullivan said finally. Irrefutable proof of their actions. Sarah opened her desk drawer and removed a small recording device. Already handled, I modified this wireless camera to clip onto my clothing. HD video with audio transmitting to a secure cloud server. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. Impressive. I also have this. She held up a panic button on a lanyard. One press sends an SOS with GPS coordinates to your phone. Sullivan nodded, decision made. Tomorrow then, but we do this my way. Controlled engagement. No unnecessary risks. Sarah straightened in her wheelchair, almost at attention. Yes, sir. As Sullivan turned to leave, Sarah called after him. Dad? Why does Jason hate me so much? What did I ever do to him? Sullivan paused in the doorway. It's not about you, it's about me. His father and I have history. Baghdad. Sullivan nodded. I caught him selling weapons to insurgents, reported him. He should have gone to prison, but his connections protected him. So he's using his son to get revenge on you through me, Sarah's voice held disbelief. That's sick. War doesn't end when you leave the battlefield, Sullivan said quietly. Some men bring it home, let it poison everything they touch, including their children. Sarah considered this. Is that why you never talk about your combat experiences, to protect me from that poison? Sullivan met his daughter's gaze. Partly, and partly because some burdens aren't meant to be shared. Maybe they are, Sarah suggested softly. Maybe sharing them makes them lighter. Sullivan didn't answer. Some weights couldn't be redistributed no matter how willing the shoulders offering to help carry them. Miller's Diner occupied the same corner of downtown Columbus it had since 1958. Chrome fixtures, red vinyl booths, and the same apple pie, recipe for 3 generations. Eleanor Miller, 65 and still working 12-hour shifts, greeted Sullivan with a warm smile as he entered. Colonel, twice in 1 month. To what do we owe the pleasure? Sullivan ordered coffee, taking a booth with clear sightlines to both entrances. Just meeting Sarah after school. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly. Those boys been bothering her again? Sullivan looked up sharply. You've seen this before. Eleanor glanced around the nearly empty diner, then lowered her voice. Last month, 4 of them came in, surrounded her booth, started making comments. I ran them off, but... She shook her head. Kids are crueler these days. Not kids, Sullivan corrected. Predators. They sense weakness and exploit it. Sarah isn't weak, Eleanor protested. No, Sullivan agreed. She isn't, but they see the wheelchair, not the person in it. Eleanor refreshed his coffee. What are you going to do about it? Sullivan's gaze returned to the entrance. Teach them to see clearly. By 3:30, Sullivan had positioned himself at a corner table with a newspaper hat pulled low, casual clothes replacing his uniform. To anyone entering, he was just another customer. Sarah sat at her usual booth, textbooks spread across the table, wheelchair positioned at the end for easy access. The surveillance equipment was in place. Miniature cameras Sullivan had acquired through former military contacts provided coverage of blind spots. Sarah wore the hidden camera clipped to her sweater, disguised as a decorative pin. The panic button hung around her neck, concealed beneath her collar. At 3:42, Jason Harris entered Miller's Diner. 5 teammates flanked him, Letterman jackets announcing their status expressions, broadcasting their intentions. Sullivan remained motionless, watching, assessing. Jason's swagger, the tight formation of his followers, the predatory glances towards Sarah. Eleanor emerged from the kitchen, coffee pot in hand, eyes wary. Boys, what can I get you? Jason ignored her, heading directly for Sarah's booth. His friends spread out, blocking escape routes, audience forming for the performance. Working hard wheels, Jason's voice carried across the diner. All that studying won't fix those legs. Sarah didn't look up from her textbook. I'm busy, Jason. Too busy for the homecoming king. He slid into the booth across from her. That hurts my feelings. You don't have feelings, Sarah replied, still not looking up. Just impulses and insecurities dressed up as personality. Sullivan suppressed a smile. His daughter had inherited more than just Kate's determination. Jason's face darkened. Think you're smart, don't you, Daddy's special little soldier girl? I know I'm smart, Sarah corrected, which is why I'm studying instead of engaging with whatever sad dominance display this is supposed to be. One of Jason's friends laughed quickly, silenced by a glare. Jason leaned forward, invading Sarah's space. You know what's sad? Thinking West Point would ever take damaged goods like you. Eleanor approached the table. That's enough. Either order something or leave. Jason looked up at the older woman. Back off, Grandma. This is between me and the cripple. Don't speak to her that way, Sarah said, finally meeting Jason's gaze. Mrs. Miller deserves your respect. Respect is earned, Jason sneered. Like my spot at state next year. Full football scholarship. What will you be doing rolling around community college? Sullivan watched his daughter's face, saw the moment she decided to engage rather than deflect. The tactician choosing her battlefield. Actually, Sarah said calmly, I've already been accepted to West Point under their exceptional candidate program. Early admission. The superintendent himself reviewed my application. The statement landed like a grenade among the football players. Jason's face contorted with rage and something else. Jealousy. Bullshit, he hissed. You're lying. Sarah shrugged. Believe what you want. The letter's framed on my wall. The only reason they'd take you is because of your dad, Jason snarled. Special treatment for the crippled daughter of the great Colonel Sullivan. Maybe, Sarah conceded, or maybe they recognize potential beyond physical limitations, something your limited imagination can't comprehend. Jason stood abruptly, knocking the table. Sarah's textbook slid toward her water glass, tipping contents, spilling across her notes. Not an accident. The first physical escalation. Eleanor moved forward. That's enough. Out of my diner, all of you. One of Jason's larger teammates blocked her path. Stay out of this, lady, unless you want trouble for your little greasy spoon. Sullivan tensed, ready to intervene. Not yet. They needed more evidence, clearer provocation. Jason circled the table, positioning himself behind Sarah's wheelchair. You know what your problem is, Sullivan? You think that chair makes you special, untouchable. He grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, jerking it backward. Sarah gasped, grabbed the table edge to stabilize herself. But you're just broken goods, Jason continued, leaning down to speak directly into her ear. A burden. Your dad's stuck with you out of duty, not love. Everyone knows it. Sarah's face remained composed, but Sullivan saw the flash of pain in her eyes. Not physical, something deeper. Let go of my chair, she said quietly. Jason responded by spinning the wheelchair, forcing Sarah to face him. Or what, you'll roll over my toes. Last warning, Sarah said, finger sliding toward the panic button. Jason laughed, looking at his friends. Listen to the cripple making threats. With deliberate malice, he lifted a glass of ice water from a nearby table and poured it slowly over Sarah's head. The shock of cold water made her gasp, textbooks and electronics now soaked. Oops, Jason smirked. Looks like you sprung a leak. Eleanor Miller moved with surprising speed for her age, swinging the coffee pot toward Jason's head. Get away from her, you little monster. One of the football players caught her arm, twisting until she cried out in pain. The coffee pot crashed to the floor, shattering. You shouldn't have done that, old woman, the boy growled. Sullivan stood, newspaper folding neatly on the table. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, like a predator shifting position before the final lunge. Jason's attention fixed on Sarah, didn't notice. He leaned closer, voice dropping to a vicious whisper. Your dad ruined my father's life. Now I'm gonna ruin yours. By the time I'm done, no school will touch you. Not West Point, not community college, not even trade school. You'll be nothing but a memory at Lincoln High, a cautionary tale. Sullivan moved silently across the diner, military training, evident in each step. Precise, controlled, deadly. And when I'm finished with you, Jason continued, maybe I'll start on your precious daddy, The great war hero. Did you know he froze under fire in Iraq? That men died because of his cowardice? My father told me everything. Sarah's eyes flicked up, looking past Jason. She smiled. What's so funny, Wheels? Jason demanded. Behind you, Sarah said simply. Jason turned smug expression faltering as he found himself face to face with Colonel Michael Sullivan. 6'2" of combat-hardened veteran eyes, cold as battlefield dawn. The diner fell absolutely silent. Even breathing seemed momentarily suspended. Sir, Jason stammered, instinctively backing away. We were just talking. Sullivan said nothing. His gaze moved methodically from Jason to each of his friends, memorizing faces, assessing threats, calculating response options. Mr. Harris, Sullivan finally spoke, voice preternaturally calm. Remove your hand from my daughter's wheelchair. Jason complied instantly, the command in Sullivan's voice, bypassing conscious thought. Sullivan turned to the boy still holding Eleanor's arm. Release Mrs. Miller, now. Again, immediate compliance. The football player stepped back, hands raised slightly as if surrendering to armed troops. Sullivan helped Eleanor to a chair, checking her wrist with gentle efficiency. Ice pack, please, he instructed another waitress who stood frozen by the counter. She hurried to comply. Only then did Sullivan return his attention to the group of suddenly diminished young men. His posture shifted subtly, weight-centered, hands relaxed at his sides. Any combat veteran would have recognized the stance, a weapon ready to be deployed. Sarah, Sullivan said without looking away from Jason, are you injured? No, Dad, just wet. Sullivan nodded once, then addressed the football players. Gentlemen, you have exactly 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't contact Sheriff Martinez about assault charges against all of you. Jason found his voice first bravado returning. We didn't assault anyone. It was just water, and she provoked us. Sullivan's eyebrow raised slightly. Provoked 6 varsity athletes twice her size is interesting tactical assessment. He stepped closer to Jason, voice lowering. Would you like to know what I see, Mr. Harris? Jason swallowed hard but held his ground. I see 6 cowards using superior numbers against a perceived weaker opponent. Basic insurgent tactics. Effective against civilians. Suicidal against trained opposition. Sullivan glanced at the broken coffee pot. I also see property damage assault against Mrs. Miller in evidence of a coordinated harassment campaign that has been documented for presentation to law enforcement. One of the other boys shifted nervously. Jason, maybe we should go. Sullivan shook his head. Too late for tactical retreat. You violated the primary rule of engagement. What rule? Jason asked, trying to maintain his facade of confidence. Never start a fight you don't know how to finish. Sullivan reached into his pocket and retrieved a small USB drive. This contains video evidence of 27 separate incidents of harassment, assault, and destruction of property committed by you and your friends against my daughter. Copies have been provided to Sheriff Martinez, Principal Parker, and the Lincoln High School Board. Jason's face paled. You're bluffing. Navy SEALs bluff. Delta Force executes. Sullivan's voice remained terrifyingly calm. Your father taught you that actions don't have consequences, that money and influence provide immunity. He was wrong. The diner door opened with a cheerful jingle that seemed bizarrely inappropriate for the tension filling the room. Richard Harris entered, expensive suit, immaculate, 2 large men in poorly concealed shoulder holsters flanking him. Well, Harris said, surveying the scene, quite the family reunion. Sullivan didn't acknowledge Harris's presence. His focus remained locked on Jason. Kneel. Jason blinked in confusion. What, kneel? Sullivan repeated. And apologize to my daughter for assaulting her. Then apologize to Mrs. Miller for damaging her property and threatening her business. Dad, Jason appealed to his father. He's trying to humiliate me. Richard Harris stepped forward, false smile firmly in place. Michael, surely we can handle this like civilized men. Boys will be boys after all. Sullivan finally turned to face his old adversary. Richard, still hiding behind others, I see. First your father's rank, now your son's youth. Some things never change. Harris's smile tightened. And you're still living in the past, fighting old wars. But this isn't Baghdad, Colonel. This is my town. Your town, Sullivan repeated, where your son can assault disabled students without consequences, where your influence protects the guilty. Sounds familiar. Harris's eyes narrowed. Careful, Michael. You're dangerously close to slander. Truth is an absolute defense against slander charges, Sullivan replied. And I have quite a collection of truths, Richard, about weapons sales to insurgents in 1991, about intelligence leaks that led to American casualties, about financial irregularities in defense contracts worth millions. Harris maintained his smile, but his eyes hardened. Ancient history, unprovable allegations. Meanwhile, I have the governor's private number. The attorney general attended my last fundraiser. The local judge's golf at my country club. Impressive, Sullivan acknowledged. Now let me tell you what I have. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward Harris. On display was a military file with top secret headers detailing Operation Sandstorm Baghdad, 1991. Where did you get that? Harris demanded, mask of affability slipping. Those files were sealed. Delta Force operators develop unique skill sets, Sullivan replied, including knowing which records to secure before they can be redacted. Insurance policies, you might say. Harris gestured to his security men. Confiscate that phone. Sullivan smiled, for the first time, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. I wouldn't recommend that course of action. These gentlemen are former Army Rangers, judging by their bearing. Good training, but insufficient against Delta. Besides, this evidence exists in multiple secure locations with distribution protocols should anything happen to me or my daughter. The security men hesitated, sensing a threat level beyond their pay grade. Harris held up his hand, stopping them. What do you want, Michael? Money, a public apology? Name it. Sullivan shook his head. Justice, consequences, lessons learned. He turned back to Jason. Your son will kneel and apologize. Then he and his friends will perform 200 hours of community service at the Veterans Rehabilitation Center. They will attend a 6-week course on respecting those with disabilities, and they will make public apologies via video that will be shared with the school. Ridiculous, Harris scoffed. I won't allow my son to be humiliated. Then I release everything, Sullivan stated flatly. The Baghdad files, the bullying evidence, your son's juvenile record that mysteriously disappeared after his DUI last year. Everything goes to the FBI, the Pentagon Inspector General, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Your Senate campaign ends before it begins. Harris studied Sullivan's face, searching for signs of bluff or hesitation. Finding none. Jason, Harris finally said, do as the colonel says. Dad, Jason protested, you can't be serious. Now, Jason, the command in Harris's voice matched Sullivan's earlier tone. Slowly, face burning with humiliation, Jason Harris sank to his knees before Sarah's wheelchair. His friends watched in shock, their social hierarchy collapsing in real time. I'm sorry, Jason muttered, eyes fixed on the floor. Look at her when you apologize, Sullivan instructed. And mean it. Jason raised his eyes to Sarah's face. The hatred there was undisguised, but beneath it lurked something unexpected. Fear, perhaps even respect. I'm sorry for assaulting you and damaging your property, Jason said, each word forced through clenched teeth. It won't happen again. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Apology accepted conditionally. Your actions going forward will determine whether I believe your words. Jason turned to Eleanor Miller. I apologize for breaking your coffee pot and threatening your business, ma'am. Eleanor's response was less diplomatic than Sarah's. You're a bully and a coward, young man, but at least you're learning there are consequences in this world. That's something. Harris stepped forward. Satisfied, Michael? Or shall we continue this public spectacle? Sullivan nodded to Sarah, who handed him a document from her still damp backpack. Community service agreement, 200 hours at the Veterans Center. Starting tomorrow, 4 p.m. Director Barnes is expecting all 6 of you. Harris took the paper, glancing at it before passing it to Jason. Sign it. Jason hesitated, then complied. Each of his friends followed suit under Sullivan's unwavering gaze. This isn't over, Michael, Harris said quietly as the boys filed out of the diner. You've won the battle, not the war. Sullivan watched them leave, posture still combat ready despite the immediate threat's departure. That's where you're wrong, Richard. This was never about winning. It's about teaching, and some lessons come harder than others. As Harris reached the door, Sullivan called after him. One more thing. Harris turned, irritation evident. What now? If anything happens to my daughter, anything at all, Sullivan said, voice pitched for Harris's ears alone, I'll hold you personally responsible, And neither your money nor your connections will protect you from what follows. Harris's face darkened. Is that a threat, Colonel? No, Richard Sullivan replied. It's a promise, from one father to another. After they had gone, Sullivan knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair, finally allowing concern to show on his weathered face. Are you sure you're okay? Sarah nodded, a smile breaking through despite her soaked clothing and books. I'm fine, Dad, really. She glanced toward the door. Do you think it worked? Will they actually leave me alone now? Sullivan helped Eleanor clean broken glass from the floor while considering his answer. The foot soldiers will. They've seen consequences and won't risk more. He straightened, decades of military bearing evident in his posture. But Richard Harris won't stop. This was personal for him, and now I've humiliated him publicly. So what happens next? Sullivan looked down at his daughter, seeing Kate's determination shining through her eyes. First, we prepare for counterattack. Because this wasn't just to Sarah. This was just the opening salvo. Outside Miller's diner, rain began to fall on Columbus, Georgia. Inside, a father and daughter planned their next move in a war most civilians would never understand. A war fought not with weapons and tactics, but with influence and information. A war where the battlefield was a high school hallway and the stakes were a young woman's future. Colonel Michael Sullivan had fought in foreign deserts and distant mountains, but never had a mission felt more critical than this one, protecting his daughter from enemies both seen and unseen, teaching her that even in a wheelchair, she stood taller than those who would diminish her. The last warrior had found his final battle, and he had no intention of losing. The morning after the confrontation at Miller's diner dawned clear and crisp. Sullivan rose before sunrise, years of military discipline embedded in his internal clock. As he prepared coffee in the kitchen, he mentally reviewed the previous day's events, analyzing strengths, weaknesses, and potential countermoves from Richard Harris. The forced apology and community service agreement were merely opening gambits in what would inevitably become a protracted campaign. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center occupied a renovated warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus. The facility specialized in treating combat veterans with physical injuries and PTSD, offering everything from physical therapy to job training. Colonel Sullivan had helped establish it 5 years earlier, using connections and personal funds to create a sanctuary for wounded warriors. The system had failed. Director Samuel Barnes retired. Army Master Sergeant, who had lost both legs in Afghanistan, greeted Sullivan in the lobby the following afternoon. Your special projects have arrived, Barnes said, nodding toward the reception area where Jason and his 5 teammates slouched in uncomfortable plastic chairs. Surly bunch, Sullivan nodded. Expected. They're here involuntarily. Most of our patients started that way too. Barnes adjusted his prosthetic leg. Pain and resentment make for poor motivation initially. Sullivan surveyed the center. 24 veterans worked through physical therapy routines. A former Marine with burn scars covering half his face spotted bench pressing weights. A young Army specialist practiced walking with a new prosthetic arm. How do you want to handle this, Sam? Sullivan asked. Barnes smiled grimly. Same way the Army handled us. Break them down, build them up. By the end of 200 hours, they'll either be better men or they'll know exactly how far they fall short. Sullivan nodded. Perfect. Jason looked up as Sullivan approached defiance written across his features. Reporting for punishment, Colonel. Not punishment, Sullivan corrected. Education. Barnes wheeled himself forward. I'm Master Sergeant Barnes. For the next 200 hours, you belong to me. You will address me as Sir. You will follow instructions immediately and without question. You will show respect to every person in this facility, regardless of rank or condition. Is that understood? The boys exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to a man in a wheelchair commanding such authority. I said, is that understood? Barnes repeated, voice hardening. Yes, sir, they mumbled in unison. I can't hear you, Barnes barked, drill sergeant persona emerging from decades past. Yes, sir, they responded more forcefully. Barnes nodded. Better. Today you'll clean bathrooms, all of them, and there are 22 in this facility. When you finish, you'll mop the gym floor. After that, you'll sort medical supplies. Sergeant Wilson will supervise. A massive black man with a prosthetic arm stepped forward, expressionless. But that'll take hours, one of Jason's friends protested. Yes, Barnes agreed. That's the point of community service. It consumes your community time in service to others. He glanced at his watch. Clock's ticking, gentlemen. Those toilets aren't cleaning themselves. As the boys were led away, Sullivan turned to Barnes. Don't break them too badly, Sam. Barnes's expression softened slightly. They're young, stupid, but potentially salvageable. We'll see what they're made of. Sullivan nodded. That's all I ask. He glanced toward the physical therapy section. Sarah's coming tomorrow to teach her chess strategy class. Good, hey, Barnes replied. Welding teaches humility like being intellectually outmaneuvered by someone you've underestimated. Sullivan's Ford F-150 rumbled along the gravel drive leading to his cabin. The setting sun painted the Georgia pines in hues of amber and gold, a peaceful scene at odds with the strategic planning occupying his mind. Richard Harris wouldn't take today's humiliation lying down. Countermeasures would be deployed. Sullivan needed to prepare. The cabin appeared ahead, nestled among the trees. Sullivan frowned. Sarah's Jeep, modified for hand controls, was missing from its usual spot. She should have been home hours ago from her volunteer work at the local library. Sullivan reached for his phone, but it rang before he could dial. Sullivan, he answered. Dad. Sarah's voice tense but controlled. Someone tampered with my Jeep. The hand controls malfunctioned while I was driving. I managed to stop it safely, but Sullivan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Where are you, Ticting? County Road 16, about 2 miles from Peterson's gas station. AAA is coming, but it'll be at least an hour. Stay in the vehicle. Doors locked. I'm 10 minutes out. Sullivan executed a perfect three-point turn, tires kicking up gravel. Dad, it wasn't an accident, Sarah continued. The bolts on the hand control assembly were deliberately loosened. I checked. Sullivan processed this information with cold clarity. Did you see anyone suspicious at the library? No, but my Jeep was parked behind the building out of sight of the security cameras. Understood. I'm coming. Sullivan ended the call, mind calculating possibilities, countermeasures, potential threats. Richard Harris had escalated faster than expected. An amateur mistake. Now Sullivan had justification for more aggressive measures. The drive to County Road 16 took 8 minutes at speeds that would have earned anyone else a substantial ticket. Sullivan spotted Sarah's modified red Jeep on the shoulder hazard lights blinking in the gathering dusk. He pulled alongside, scanning the area for threats before exiting his truck. Sarah sat in the driver's seat, calm but alert, the .38 revolver Sullivan had given her for her 16th birthday visible on her lap. She had been raised by a Delta operator. Preparedness was second nature. Smart girl, Sullivan said, nodding at the weapon as he opened her door. Calculated risk assessment, she replied with a small smile, some of the tension leaving her shoulders at his arrival. Low probability of actual threat, high consequence if wrong. Sullivan examined the hand control assembly. The modification allowed Sarah to accelerate and brake using hand levers rather than pedals. Someone had systematically loosened the mounting bolts. Not enough to cause immediate failure, but sufficient to create a dangerous situation after some vibration from normal driving. Professional job, Sarah asked, watching his inspection. Sullivan shook his head. Amateur hour, probably one of Jason's friends with basic mechanical knowledge. A professional would have cut the brake line completely. Comforting, Sarah said dryly. Sullivan checked under the vehicle, then the engine compartment. No other tampering evident. We'll have your friend Mike at the garage do a complete inspection tomorrow. For now, I'll drive you home in my truck. AAA can take the Jeep directly to the shop. As they waited for the tow truck, Sullivan made a call. Frank, it's Mike. Someone tampered with Sarah's vehicle today. Deliberate sabotage of the hand controls. He listened briefly. No, she's fine. Handled it perfectly. But I need this documented officially. Sheriff Martinez arrived 15 minutes later, patrol lights painting the trees blue and red. He examined the vehicle, took photographs, and made notes while Sarah provided a statement. This crosses a line, Mike Martinez said quietly as Sarah finished her statement with the deputy. Vehicle tampering is a felony. Could have killed her. Sullivan's face remained impassive, but his eyes had taken on the cold focus his enemies had learned to fear. Options? Officially, I'll investigate, take statements, file reports. Probably get nowhere because there's no direct evidence linking anyone to the tampering. Martinez sighed. Unofficially, watch your back. Harris is playing hardball faster than expected. Sullivan nodded. Noted. Mike, Martinez said, glancing at Sarah. Don't do anything I'll have to arrest you for. Sullivan's expression didn't change. I never leave evidence, Frank. You know that. Martinez shook his head. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. The Sullivan home security system received a substantial upgrade that evening. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, reinforced doors, military-grade encryption on all communications devices. Sullivan worked methodically until past midnight, transforming the rustic cabin into a hardened defensive position without altering its outward appearance. Sarah watched from her wheelchair as he installed the last camera. This seems excessive for a few teenage bullies. It's not for them, Sullivan replied, testing the camera's field of view. Richard Harris has resources, connections. This is for the professionals he might employ. You really think he'd go that far over a Senate campaign? Sullivan descended from the ladder. It's not about the campaign anymore. It's about pride, control. I humiliated him publicly, forced his son to kneel. Men like Harris don't tolerate such insults. Sarah considered this. So what's our next move? We maintain position, continue as planned. The boys perform their community service. You attend school normally, but with enhanced security protocols. Sullivan checked the security system's central panel. I'll drive you until your Jeep is cleared. And what about offense? You always said the best defense is a good offense. Sullivan smiled slightly. You were paying attention during those strategy lectures. Always, Sarah replied. So what's the offensive strategy? Sullivan sat heavily in his recliner, suddenly looking his 62 years. I need to consider options carefully. Richard has political aspirations, powerful allies. Moving against him requires precision. Sarah wheeled closer. Tell me about Baghdad. What really happened between you two? Sullivan was silent for a long moment. Some battlefields he never revisited, even in conversation. But Sarah deserved to understand why she had become collateral damage in an old war. 1991, Operation Desert Storm. I was commanding a Delta Force unit conducting operations behind enemy lines in Iraq. Sullivan's eyes grew distant. We received intelligence about American weapons being sold to Iraqi forces, followed the trail back to a supply depot overseen by Lieutenant Richard Harris. He was selling weapons to the enemy, Sarah asked. Sullivan nodded. And intelligence. Troop movements, patrol schedules. We caught him red-handed, documented everything. 3 American soldiers died in an ambush because of information he provided. He should have faced a firing squad for treason. But he didn't. No, his father was Major General William Harris, had friends in the Pentagon, connections in Washington. Richard received a general discharge record sealed. The men who died were listed as casualties of enemy action. Their families never knew the truth. Sarah processed this information. So you've been carrying this for 12 years. The knowledge that he got away with it. Some burdens don't lighten with time, Sullivan replied. And now he's running for Senate. Sarah shook her head. With access to classified intelligence committees. Yes, Sullivan's voice hardened, which is why this isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. It's about national security. A man who would sell out his country once would do it again. So we stop him, Sarah said simply, whatever it takes. Sullivan studied his daughter, seeing Kate's determination in her eyes. It won't be clean or easy. Harris will fight dirty. So we fight smarter. Sarah's chin lifted. You taught me that superior strategy beats superior resources every time. Sullivan nodded slowly. First step is intelligence gathering. We need everything on his Senate campaign. Donors, platform, scheduled appearances. I can handle that, Sarah said. His campaign website has security worse than the school's network. Good. Meanwhile, I'll contact some old friends from the unit. Men who remember Baghdad. Sullivan's expression darkened. Men who lost comrades because of Harris's treachery. As Sullivan continued outlining their strategy, he felt a familiar sensation settling over him. The cold clarity that preceded combat operations. The focused precision that had kept him alive across 3 decades of warfare. Richard Harris had made a critical error in targeting Sarah. He had awakened the warrior Sullivan had worked hard to contain in civilian life. This time, Harris wouldn't escape consequences. The Veterans Rehabilitation Center hummed with activity. Physical therapists guided wounded warriors through recovery exercises. Counselors conducted PTSD support groups. And in the recreation area, Sarah Sullivan conducted her weekly chess strategy class with 5 disabled veterans. Chess isn't just about moving pieces, she explained, wheelchair positioned at the head of the table. It's about thinking 3 moves ahead, anticipating your opponent's strategy, creating situations where every choice they have is bad. The men listened attentively. Captain James Monroe, who had lost an arm in Fallujah, Sergeant Eric Thompson blinded by an IED, Corporal David Washington paralyzed from the waist down like Sarah herself, Lieutenant Mike Ramirez recovering from severe burns, Staff Sergeant Tom Phillips battling PTSD and traumatic brain injury. They respected her not because of her wheelchair, but despite it. Sarah had proven herself through intellectual rigor, tactical brilliance, and unwavering determination. Here she wasn't defined by her disability, but by her mind. From across the facility, Sullivan watched with pride as his daughter demonstrated a complex strategic maneuver on the demonstration board. Director Barnes wheeled up beside him. "Your boys are making progress," Barnes noted, nodding toward a corner where Jason and his friends scrubbed floors under Sergeant Wilson's watchful eye. "Slowly, painfully, but progress." Sullivan nodded. "Any standouts, good or bad?" "The ringleader, Jason. He's the most resistant, but also the most observant. Watches everything, especially the amputees working out. Comparing himself, I think. Realizing how soft his life has been." Sullivan had noticed the same thing. Jason's defiance remained, but it was tempered now with uncertainty. The foundation of his worldview was cracking, revealing glimpses of a different reality than the one his father had constructed for him. "And that one," Barnes continued, pointing to Tyler McKenzie, Jason's second-in-command on the football field. "He's got potential. Asked Ramirez about his burns yesterday. Actually listened to the answer." Sullivan watched as Tyler mopped the floor near where Lieutenant Ramirez was doing physical therapy. The boy's body language had changed. Less swagger, more attention. "Time will tell," Sullivan said. 200 hours is enough to start a transformation. Not enough to complete one. "Speaking of transformation," Barnes said, lowering his voice, "your daughter is extraordinary. Those men have responded better to her chest therapy than to any traditional PTSD treatment we've tried. The strategic thinking focuses them, gives them purpose again." Sullivan nodded. "Sarah has that effect on people, makes them see beyond limitations." "West Point will be lucky to have her," Barnes said. "They know that, right?" "They will," Sullivan replied. The center's front doors opened, admitting Sheriff Martinez in full uniform. His expression as he approached Sullivan suggested official business rather than a social call. "Mike," Martinez greeted him. "We need to talk." They moved to Barnes's office for privacy. Martinez declined the offered seat, remaining standing, weight shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. "I've got a problem, Mike," Martinez began. "Judge issued a search warrant for your residence, looking for classified documents you allegedly removed illegally from military custody." Sullivan's expression didn't change. "Richard Harris works fast." "Too fast," Martinez agreed. "This came directly from the federal level. Judge Watkins signed it without question. Harris has friends in high places, just like he said. When tomorrow morning, 0800, FBI agents from the Atlanta field office." Martinez looked pained. "I've known you 30 years, Mike, served with you. I know you wouldn't betray operational security. But legally, my hands are tied. I have to execute the warrant." Sullivan nodded. "Understood. You're doing your job, Frank." "Whatever they're looking for," Martinez said carefully, "it would be better if it wasn't in your home when we arrive." Sullivan smiled slightly. "Noted." "There's more," Martinez continued. "Harris has filed a restraining order preventing you from coming within 500 feet of his son. Claims you're intimidating the boy, interfering with his education and athletic career." "Convenient timing," Sullivan observed. "Tomorrow is Jason's 3rd day of community service." "I suspect that's the point," Martinez replied. "Harris is systematically cutting off your options. The search warrant gives him access to your home. The restraining order separates you from his son. He's isolating targets just like we taught in urban warfare training." Sullivan processed this information with the calm efficiency of a combat veteran. "What about Sarah?" "Nothing there yet, but I'd bet it's coming. Harris is methodical, if nothing else." Sullivan considered his options. "Thank you for the warning, Frank." Martinez hesitated. "Mike, whatever you're planning, be careful. Harris has resources we can't match. Political connections, money, media influence." "I've faced worse odds," Sullivan replied evenly. "Baghdad, Mogadishu, Kandahar, men with greater resources, better positions, more firepower. This isn't combat, Mike. Sullivan's eyes hardened. It became combat when he targeted my daughter. Martinez sighed. Just remember, I can't protect you if you cross certain lines. Badge comes first, even with old friends. I'd never ask you to compromise your oath, Frank. What happens next will be entirely within legal boundaries. Sullivan's expression suggested otherwise. Just extremely unpleasant for Richard Harris. As Martinez left, Sullivan watched Sarah through the office window. She was demonstrating a complex endgame to her student's wheelchair positioned confidently at the head of the table. Whatever moved against Richard Harris, it would have to protect her first. No acceptable military strategy exposed your most valuable asset to enemy fire. The midnight sky above Sullivan's cabin was clear stars, brilliant in the absence of city lights. Inside, Sarah slept soundly, the security system's soft hum providing a technological lullaby. In his study, Sullivan methodically removed the accumulated evidence of 30 years military service. The files on Baghdad were first. Operation Sandstorm dossiers, after-action reports, surveillance photographs showing Lieutenant Richard Harris meeting with Iraqi intelligence officers, intelligence that had never seen proper military justice due to political interference. Next came personal records, citations for valor with classified mission details, photographs with Delta Force operators whose identities remain confidential, operational plans for missions still denied by the Pentagon. Sullivan worked with military precision, sorting documents into three categories: those to be secured in a new location, those to be destroyed, those to be strategically discovered during tomorrow's search. The grandfather clock in the living room chimed twice. Sullivan paused, listening to the familiar sound. A wedding gift from Kate's parents 30 years ago. One of the few links to a time before war had defined his existence. His secure phone vibrated. Sullivan answered without speaking. Sandman confirmed. The voice belonged to retired Major James Wilson, former Delta Force current private security consultant. Package secure at alternate location. Acknowledged, Sullivan replied. Echo protocol in effect. Understood. Team in position. All quiet on target's residence. Sullivan ended the call satisfied. Wilson had been with him in Baghdad, had lost his best friend in the ambush. Harris's information had enabled. Retirement hadn't dulled his skills or his memory. When Sullivan had called yesterday, Wilson had responded without hesitation. Old debts never expire, Wilson had said, especially those paid in blood. Sullivan returned to his task, placing selected documents in locations where FBI agents would certainly find them. Nothing classified, nothing that would trigger genuine national security concerns, but enough to support the narrative that Sullivan possessed potentially damaging information about Richard Harris, the bait in the trap. By the time Sullivan finished, pre-dawn light painted the eastern sky in shades of pearl. He secured his home office, double-checked the security system, and prepared coffee. Sarah would awaken soon. They had preparations to make before the FBI arrived. Sullivan stood at the kitchen window watching the Georgia forest come alive with morning light. 30 years of combat operations had taught him patience. Richard Harris was making predictable moves, telegraphing his strategy through legal maneuvers and intimidation tactics. The colonel sipped his coffee, military mind processing, variables calculating responses. Harris had power, influence, political connections. Sullivan had experienced strategy and the moral high ground. In warfare, the latter often prevailed against seemingly insurmountable odds. Harris had forgotten the most important lesson from Baghdad. Never underestimate an opponent fighting for something greater than himself. Sarah's wheelchair hummed softly as she entered the kitchen. You didn't sleep, she observed. Sullivan turned. Tactical preparation. For the FBI search, she nodded toward the coffee pot. I heard Sheriff Martinez yesterday. Sullivan poured her a cup, adding the precise amount of cream she preferred. They'll arrive at 0800. We'll be gone by 0730. Spend the day at the center while they search. What will they find? Enough to keep Harris believing his strategy is working. Sullivan sat across from her. Meanwhile, we accelerate our timeline. Sarah nodded. I accessed his campaign donor records last night. Found some interesting patterns. Substantial contributions from foreign corporations routed through domestic subsidiaries, potentially illegal under campaign finance laws. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. You hacked his donor database. No hacking required. Their cybersecurity is non-existent. Sarah sipped her coffee. Also, he's speaking at the Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall next Thursday, campaigning on his distinguished military service and support for veterans. Sullivan's expression hardened. Bold move considering his actual record. That's not all, Sarah continued. Jason isn't coming to the center today. His father pulled him from the community service program entirely, filed some kind of emergency petition with the court. Expected, Sullivan replied. Harris is systematically dismantling our position. Search warrant, restraining order, legal maneuvers to protect Jason. So what's our counter strategy? Sullivan considered his daughter. 17 years old, confined to a wheelchair, yet possessing a tactical mind that would have made her an exceptional officer even without her physical limitations. Kate would have been proud. We changed the battlefield, Sullivan said simply. Harris expects us to fight defensively, legal countermoves, procedural responses. Instead, we take the offensive in an unexpected direction. Sarah's eyes lit with understanding. The VFW speech. Sullivan nodded. Richard Harris, standing before veterans, claiming military honors while concealing treachery. Perfect symmetry. He'll have security, Sarah pointed out. Media, campaign staff. Yes, Sullivan agreed. And we'll have truth, documentation, and an audience of veterans who understand the cost of betrayal in combat. Sarah's expression grew concerned. What about legal consequences for both of us? Calculated risk, Sullivan replied. Sometimes completing the mission requires accepting potential casualties. I don't like that analogy when the potential casualty is you in federal prison, Sarah said firmly. There must be a way to expose him without crossing legal boundaries. Sullivan studied his daughter, always the strategist seeing angles he might miss in his focus on the objective. What do you suggest? We need leverage, Sarah said thoughtfully. Something that forces Harris to back down permanently, not just win the immediate conflict. Sullivan considered this approach. The donor information you found. That could be leveraged without revealing classified materials. Sarah nodded eagerly. And we could anonymously provide evidence of the vehicle tampering to the media. Create enough questions about Harris that his Senate campaign falters under its own weight. Indirect approach, Sullivan acknowledged. Less risk of blowback. Sun Tzu Wu, Sarah quoted. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. Sullivan smiled. You've been studying. I had a good teacher. Sarah glanced at the clock. We should move soon. FBI will be prompt. As they prepared to depart, Sullivan surveyed his home. The files were placed, the trap baited. FBI agents would find exactly what he wanted them to find, no more, no less. Richard Harris would believe his strategy was working, never realizing he was being maneuvered into a vulnerable position. The morning sun illuminated the cabin's wooden exterior, creating an image of rustic tranquility that belied the strategic warfare being conducted within its walls. Sullivan helped Sarah into his truck, securing her wheelchair in the bed. What about Jason and the other boys? Sarah asked as they drove away. If Harris has pulled them from the community service program, they've learned nothing. Sullivan's expression remained impassive. Jason Harris has been observed, assessed. His response to the veterans was noteworthy, meaning there might be hope for him despite his father's influence. Sullivan navigated the rural roads with practiced ease. Sometimes the most effective strategy targets unexpected vulnerabilities. Sarah studied her father's profile. You're going to turn Jason against his own father. Sullivan didn't confirm or deny. Let's just say all assets remain in play. Behind them, a convoy of black SUVs approached the Sullivan cabin. FBI agents in tactical gear prepared to execute their search warrant, unaware they were simply pieces being moved on a chessboard they couldn't see. A game where Colonel Michael Sullivan had already calculated 20 moves ahead. The last warrior was in his element once again. Not on a battlefield of sand and blood, but one of information and influence. The weapons had changed. The strategic principles remained identical. And Richard Harris was about to learn why Sullivan's Delta Force unit had named him the Ghost. Not because he moved silently, because by the time you realized he was targeting you, it was already too late. Boom. Jason Harris stared at the closed doors of the Veterans Rehabilitation Center from the passenger seat of his father's Mercedes. 2 days of community service had been enough to shake foundations he hadn't known could be questioned. Men with missing limbs who complained less than he did after a tough football practice. Warriors confined to wheelchairs who commanded respect without raising their voices. And Sarah Sullivan, brilliant, composed, respected by hardened veterans despite her age and gender, teaching chess to men who had seen combat while he struggled to remember football plays. "You don't have to go back there," Richard Harris said from behind the wheel. "Judge Conway signed the order this morning. Community service requirement waived due to undue hardship and psychological distress." Jason continued staring at the center's entrance. "What about the others?" "Tom Ryan, the rest of the team. All included," his father replied with satisfaction. "I've spoken with their parents. Everyone agrees this was an excessive punishment for harmless teenage behavior." Jason turned. "Harmless. We dumped water on a girl in a wheelchair, threatened an old woman, broke her property." Harris's expression hardened. "Don't tell me Sullivan's brainwashing worked this quickly. They were trying to humiliate you, Jason, break you down, turn you against your friends, your family." "Maybe," Jason conceded, "or maybe they were trying to teach us something." "Like what? How to feel sorry for cripples, how to waste your potential serving those who couldn't cut it in real combat." Harris gripped the steering wheel tighter. "The Sullivans of this world want to drag down the successful, the powerful. They call it justice. I call it envy." Jason thought about Sergeant Wilson, who had supervised their cleaning duties. The man had lost an arm in Afghanistan, yet could still outwork any of them. Had shared combat stories during breaks not to impress, but to illuminate the bond between warriors. Had treated them firmly but fairly, demanding their best without cruelty. "There's a guy in there," Jason said slowly. "Lieutenant Ramirez. Burns over 60% of his body from pulling his men out of a burning Humvee. Could have left them. Saved himself. Chose differently." Harris scoffed. "And what did it get him? Disfigurement, pain, dependency on government benefits. Is that what you aspire to?" Jason didn't answer immediately. For the first time in his 17 years, he was questioning his father's perspective. The certainty that had defined his worldview was developing cracks, allowing new light to enter. "What really happened between you and Colonel Sullivan?" Jason finally asked. "In Baghdad," Harris's face tightened. "Ancient history, military politics, nothing for you to worry about. He said you sold weapons to the enemy, that soldiers died because of intelligence you leaked." "Lies." Harris slammed his hand against the dashboard. "Sullivan was jealous of my connections, my father's rank. When supply inventory discrepancies occurred, he needed a scapegoat. I was convenient." Jason studied his father's face, looking for truth. He'd never questioned his father's version of events before. Had accepted without examination that Michael Sullivan was the villain, an embittered old soldier nursing ancient grudges. Now uncertainty crept in. "Is that why you've been having me target Sarah, because of something that happened when I was 5 years old?" Harris started the car, expression closing like a vault. "This conversation is over. You're free of community service. The restraining order prevents Sullivan from approaching you. By next week, FBI investigators will have found illegally obtained classified documents in his home, discrediting him completely. We're winning, Jason. That's what matters." As they pulled away from the Veterans Center, Jason found himself looking back, an unfamiliar emptiness forming in his chest. For 2 days, he had glimpsed a world where strength was measured not by dominance over others, but by sacrifice for them. Where wheelchair-bound men commanded respect through character rather than intimidation. Where Sarah Sullivan was seen not as a cripple, but as a leader. His father's voice interrupted these uncomfortable reflections. "Focus on football, son. State championship next week, then graduation, then state university with a full scholarship. The path to success is clear. Don't let Sullivan and his damaged daughter distract you from your destiny." Jason nodded automatically, but his mind remained at the Veterans Center, with the men whose broken bodies housed unbroken spirits. And with Sarah Sullivan, who had looked at him not with hatred, but with something more devastating. Disappointment, as though she had expected better of him. Had seen potential he hadn't known existed. For the first time in his life, Jason Harris felt unworthy of someone's regard. And strangely, that feeling mattered more than all the adulation his athletic prowess had ever earned him. The FBI search of Sullivan's cabin lasted 6 hours. Agents documented, photographed, and seized selected files exactly as Sullivan had anticipated. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Martinez called with an update. "They found exactly what they were looking for," Martinez reported. Documents suggesting you possess classified material related to Richard Harris's military service. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to justify continued investigation. Sullivan, seated in Director Barnes's office at the Veterans Center, nodded. As expected, Harris needed justification to escalate. Now he believes he has it. Mike, this is serious, Martinez warned. FBI doesn't appreciate being manipulated. If they determine those documents were planted, they won't, Sullivan replied confidently. Because they weren't. Every file they found is legitimately mine, accumulated through proper channels during my military service. But not the really damaging stuff, Martinez guessed. You moved that beforehand. Sullivan neither confirmed nor denied. What's Harris's next move? Judge Conway has scheduled a hearing on the community service requirement. Almost certainly will vacate the agreement entirely. Harris's influence at work. Martinez sounded frustrated. He's also pushing for a broader restraining order that would include Sarah, claiming psychological distress to his son. Predicted response, Sullivan said. Harris is systematically removing constraints on his son while limiting our options. He's winning, Mike, Martinez said bluntly. Using the system against you masterfully. Sullivan smiled slightly. Appearance versus reality, Frank. Sometimes allowing your opponent to believe they're winning is strategically advantageous. After ending the call, Sullivan watched through the office window as Sarah conducted her chess class. The veterans were focused on her demonstration of a complex sacrifice that would ultimately lead to checkmate 5 moves later. Sacrifice immediate position for decisive advantage. Give to gain. Strategy over impulse. Richard Harris was accustomed to opponents who fought directly power against power. He wasn't prepared for asymmetric warfare, for an opponent willing to lose battles to win the war, for someone who had learned strategic patience in the harshest combat zones on Earth. Sullivan had allowed Harris to believe his legal maneuvers were working, had let him dismantle the community service requirement, separate Jason from the veterans' influence, obtain search warrants and restraining orders. Each victory reinforcing Harris's confidence in his approach, each step drawing him further into the trap Sullivan had methodically constructed. Sarah finished her demonstration to appreciative nods from the veterans. Even confined to a wheelchair, she commanded the room with intellectual authority and genuine compassion. In her, Sullivan saw the future he had fought to protect across 3 decades of service, a future where integrity and moral courage mattered more than physical strength or political influence. Richard Harris represented everything Sullivan had spent his life opposing. Corruption masquerading as success, self-interest disguised as leadership, betrayal hidden behind patriotic rhetoric. The VFW speech was 4 days away. Harris would stand before veterans claiming kinship with their sacrifice while concealing his treachery, the perfect stage for his exposure, the ideal battlefield for Sullivan's counteroffensive. But first, one more piece needed to be moved into position. Sullivan left Barnes's office, nodding to Sarah as he passed her class. She raised an eyebrow questioningly. He gave a slight shake of his head. Not yet. The timing had to be perfect. Outside the center, Sullivan made a call to James Wilson. Status report. Target has visited campaign headquarters, law office, and courthouse, Wilson reported. Currently at Country Club with Judge Conway. Lunch meeting. Consolidated his position, Sullivan noted. Feeling secure. Appears so. Security posture relaxed. Standard 2-man detail. Minimal surveillance awareness. Perfect. Proceed with phase 2. Sullivan ended the call, satisfaction settling over him. Richard Harris believed he was winning a legal and political battle. He had no idea he was being maneuvered into position for a kill shot that would destroy not just his Senate campaign, but his entire carefully constructed public image. The last warrior had learned patience in combat zones where hesitation meant death and impulsiveness meant mission failure. He could wait days, weeks, months if necessary for the perfect moment to strike. Richard Harris, accustomed to immediate gratification, couldn't comprehend such strategic patience. Sullivan started his truck, heading back to the temporary safe house Wilson had arranged. The FBI might be watching the cabin, but they wouldn't find Sullivan or Sarah there. Operational security dictated changing locations once the enemy had identified your position. Basic tactics Harris had apparently forgotten from his abbreviated military career. 4 more days until the VFW speech. 4 more days to position assets, confirm intelligence, and ensure the trap was inescapable. 4 more days until Richard Harris learned the true meaning of consequences. Sullivan smiled grimly as he drove. The battle was shifting from defense to offense. And offense had always been where Michael Sullivan excelled. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall in downtown Columbus had stood since 1947, built by men returning from the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific. Its brick exterior remained unchanged, a testament to the enduring bond between those who had faced combat together. Inside, folding chairs arranged in neat rows filled quickly as veterans of various ages gathered to hear Senate candidate Richard Harris speak about his military service and vision for America. Sullivan sat in the back row, baseball cap pulled low, unrecognizable in civilian clothes. Beside him, James Wilson scanned the crowd with the practiced eye of a security professional. Both men noted the positions of Harris's security detail, the campaign staffers controlling access, the local media setting up cameras. 10 minutes until showtime, Wilson murmured. You sure about this approach? Still time for more direct measures. Sullivan shook his head slightly. Justice, not vengeance. Public exposure, not personal retribution. Wilson nodded, though his expression suggested preference for the latter option. His best friend had died in the Baghdad ambush, enabled by Harris's treachery. Some debts could only be paid in blood, but Sullivan had convinced him this method would inflict deeper, more lasting damage. The VFW post commander approached the podium, a Vietnam veteran with a Purple Heart pin on his lapel. He welcomed the crowd, spoke briefly about the organization's mission, then introduced the candidate with practiced political neutrality. Richard Harris strode to the podium with calculated confidence, handsome in his tailored suit, silver hair perfectly styled. His smile projected sincerity as he surveyed the room of veterans. My fellow warriors, Harris began, voice resonating through the sound system. I stand before you not just as a candidate, but as one of you. A brother in arms who understands the sacrifice, the courage, the commitment that defines military service. Sullivan's expression remained impassive as Harris described his distinguished career in Army Supply Corps during Operation Desert Storm. The practiced humility, the carefully crafted anecdotes about serving alongside America's finest, the strategic omissions regarding his general discharge. And that experience, Harris continued, taught me what Washington has forgotten. That American military must be respected, funded, and deployed with clear strategic purpose. When I reach the Senate, I will ensure our warriors have everything they need to defend our great nation. Applause followed, though Sullivan noted it was polite rather than enthusiastic. Veterans could often sense authenticity or its absence in those claiming kinship with their experiences. As Harris moved to the foreign policy portion of his speech, the VFW Hall's side door opened quietly. Sarah Sullivan wheeled herself in, accompanied by Sheriff Martinez in full uniform. They remained at the room's periphery observing. Harris faltered momentarily upon seeing them, a barely perceptible pause in his practiced delivery. Then his professional smile returned as he continued outlining his platform's military provisions. Questions from our members will now be welcomed, the post commander announced as Harris concluded his prepared remarks. Several hands rose. Harris fielded predictable inquiries about veterans' benefits, defense spending, and foreign deployments with practiced responses. Each answer reinforced his carefully constructed image, the patriotic veteran committed to military strength and service member support. After 15 minutes, the post commander scanned the room. Final question before we conclude. Sullivan raised his hand. The commander nodded toward him. The gentleman in the back. Sullivan stood removing his cap. Recognition rippled through the room. Many present knew Colonel Michael Sullivan either personally or by reputation. His decades of service, his role establishing the Veterans Rehabilitation Center, his advocacy for wounded warriors. Harris's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as Sullivan approached a microphone set up in the aisle. Mr. Harris, Sullivan began, voice carrying the calm authority that had commanded men in combat. You spoke eloquently about your military service during Desert Storm. I'm curious if you could elaborate on your role in Operation Sandstorm Baghdad, 1991. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Harris maintained his smile, though it no longer reached his eyes. I'm afraid some operations remain classified, Colonel Sullivan. As I'm sure you understand. Harris gestured to the next questioner. Perhaps we could move to another topic. That won't be necessary, came a new voice from the entrance. All heads turned as 3 men in dark suits entered, credentials displayed. Special Agent Thomas Reed, FBI. This is Agent Carter and Agent Ramirez. Reed approached the podium. Mr. Harris, we need to speak with you regarding potential violations of the Espionage Act related to classified information from Operation Desert Storm. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Harris's campaign manager rushed forward, whispering urgently in his ear. Harris's face had drained of color, professional veneer cracking. This is absurd, Harris declared, attempting to regain control. A political stunt orchestrated by Colonel Sullivan, who has a personal vendetta against me. I'll be happy to address any questions through proper channels with my attorneys present. Agent Reed remained impassive. Sir, this investigation was initiated based on new evidence provided by multiple sources, including recently declassified materials from Pentagon archives. Colonel Sullivan has no connection to our investigation. Sullivan had indeed ensured no connection existed. The evidence had come through Wilson and other former Delta operators who had served in Baghdad, men who remembered the betrayal and had maintained their own documentation. Military intelligence officers who had investigated the ambush deaths. Supply sergeants who had tracked the missing weapons. All compiled independently, all leading to the same conclusion. Harris attempted to depart through a side exit only to find Sheriff Martinez blocking his path. Richard Harris, Martinez stated formally, you're also wanted for questioning regarding the attempted vehicular homicide of Sarah Sullivan through criminal tampering with safety equipment. Harris's face contorted with rage. This is outrageous. I demand to speak with the governor immediately. The VFW hall had erupted in confused conversation. Veterans, campaign staff, and media all trying to process the dramatic turn of events. Cameras captured everything as Harris was escorted outside by FBI agents not technically under arrest, but clearly not free to leave. Sullivan remained standing in the aisle watching, not with satisfaction or triumph, but with the solemn recognition that justice long delayed was finally approaching. Richard Harris would face proper investigation for his actions, both past and present. The system Sullivan had served and defended for 30 years was working as intended. As the commotion continued, Sarah wheeled toward her father. Did you know this would happen today? Sullivan shook his head. Expected it within the week, not today specifically. The FBI moves on its own timeline. But you orchestrated it, she observed. Set the pieces in motion. I merely ensured the truth reached those responsible for acting on it. Sullivan's weathered face revealed nothing. The rest followed naturally. Sarah studied her father. Is it enough? After 12 years of waiting, Sullivan considered the question. Justice isn't about personal satisfaction. It's about accountability, consequences for actions. Harris will face both now. Outside media vans were already arriving, drawn by police scanner reports of the Senate candidate's detainment. Inside, veterans approached Sullivan, some offering handshakes, others asking questions he couldn't yet answer. The public exposure phase of his strategy was unfolding perfectly beyond even his meticulous planning. Richard Harris's political career had ended before the evening news. His carefully constructed public image would not survive the coming storm of investigation and revelation. The man who had escaped consequences through connections and influence for decades was finally facing a system he couldn't manipulate. As Sullivan and Sarah departed, James Wilson fell into step beside them. Mission accomplished, Colonel. Sullivan glanced back at the VFW hall, now surrounded by media. Phase 1 complete. Defensive position secured. In Phase 2, Wilson asked. Begins tomorrow, Sullivan replied. There's still Jason to consider. The Harris residence occupied 5 manicured acres in Columbus's most exclusive neighborhood. Colonial architecture, marble columns, landscape gardens, visible through wrought iron gates. A monument to success achieved through any means necessary. Jason Harris sat alone in his bedroom, surrounded by football trophies and college recruitment letters, watching his father's disgrace unfold on every news channel. FBI investigation, allegations of treason, connections to sabotage of a disabled teenager's vehicle. The Harris name, once representing power and privilege, now synonymous with betrayal and cowardice. His phone vibrated continuously. Teammates, friends, reporters seeking comment. He ignored them all, mind replaying fragments of conversations at the Veterans Center. Lieutenant Ramirez describing sacrifice for fellow soldiers. Sergeant Wilson demonstrating quiet dignity despite his missing arm. Sarah Sullivan commanding respect without demanding it. And his father's voice insisting it was all politics and envy. That the Sullivans were enemies to be crushed, not humans deserving respect. That power and influence mattered more than honor or integrity. For 17 years, Jason had never questioned these lessons, had embraced them, embodied them, enforced them in the hallways of Lincoln High School, had targeted Sarah Sullivan without hesitation, seeing only a means to hurt the colonel through his daughter. Now watching his father being escorted from the VFW hall by FBI agents, doubt crystallized into certainty. He had been wrong, catastrophically, inexcusably wrong. The doorbell rang, breaking his reverie. Jason ignored it, knowing reporters had been buzzing the gate for hours. His mother was staying with her sister, unwilling to face the media scrutiny. The house staff had been dismissed. He was alone with the consequences of his father's actions and his own. His phone rang. Unknown number. He almost ignored it before curiosity won out. Hello. Jason Harris. A familiar voice. Colonel Sullivan. Jason's grip tightened on the phone. How did you get this number? Military intelligence has its advantages, Sullivan replied. More importantly, how are you doing? The question caught Jason off guard. Not accusations or threats, but concern. Why do you care? Because you're 17 and your world just imploded through no direct action of yours. Sullivan's voice remained steady. That warrants checking in. Jason swallowed hard, throat suddenly tight. I'm fine. No, you're not, Sullivan countered. No one would be under these circumstances. But you have options beyond sitting alone in that house while reporters camp outside your gate. What options? My father's facing federal charges. Our name is radioactive. Even my football scholarship is probably gone. Your father's actions are not yours, Sullivan said firmly, unless you choose to repeat them. I bullied your daughter, Jason pointed out, confusion mixing with a strange sense of relief at finally saying it aloud. I targeted her specifically because of who her father was. How is that different? You're 17, Sullivan repeated, old enough to know better, young enough to change course. The question is whether you want to. Jason stared at the television, muted now, but still showing that his father's face beside headlines about treason and attempted vehicular homicide. I don't know what I want anymore. Then figure it out, Sullivan challenged. Start by asking yourself what kind of man you want to be. Your father's version or your own? Jason remained silent, the question resonating deeper than he wanted to admit. The front gate will open in exactly 15 minutes, Sullivan continued. A truck will be waiting at the end of your driveway. If you want a chance to define yourself beyond your father's shadow, be in it. The line went dead. Jason stared at the phone, then out his window at the media vans visible beyond the property gates. 15 minutes to decide which path to follow. His father's road of privilege without principle or an unknown direction, offered by the man his family had targeted for years. For the first time in his life, Jason Harris faced a decision his father's influence couldn't resolve. A crossroads requiring personal courage rather than borrowed power. The kind of moment that defined a man's character more permanently than any victory on a football field. 14 minutes later, Jason Harris walked out his front door carrying nothing but his wallet, phone, and a high school backpack. He moved with purpose toward the gate, which opened exactly as promised, revealing a familiar Ford F-150 idling beyond the media encampment. Colonel Sullivan sat behind the wheel, expression unreadable as Jason approached. No words were exchanged as Jason entered the passenger side. No immediate explanations or conditions. Just a nod of acknowledgement as Sullivan put the truck in gear, leaving the gated mansion and its besieging media behind. Where are we going? Jason finally asked as they turned onto the main road. Veterans Rehabilitation Center, Sullivan replied. You have community service hours to complete. After everything that's happened, you still expect me to do that? Sullivan glanced at him. Especially after everything that's happened. Commitments matter most when they're difficult to honor. Jason stared out the window, processing this perspective so foreign to his upbringing. My father always taught me that commitments were negotiable when circumstances changed. And how has that philosophy served him? Sullivan asked quietly. Jason had no answer. The Veterans Center was quieter than usual, many residents and staff following the breaking news about Richard Harris. Director Barnes greeted Sullivan and Jason in the lobby, eyebrows rising slightly at the unexpected pairing. Interesting developments, Barnes commented, both here and on the news. Sullivan nodded. Jason has decided to continue his community service commitment regardless of external circumstances. Barnes studied the teenager with new interest. Voluntary return, noteworthy. He wheeled himself around. Follow me, Mr. Harris. We'll adjust your assignment given your solo status today. Jason followed, glancing back once at Sullivan, who remained in the lobby. No supervision, no oversight, just the expectation that Jason would fulfill his obligation without enforcement. Barnes led him to the physical therapy section, where Lieutenant Ramirez was struggling with rehabilitation exercises, burn scars visible across his arms and neck. Lieutenant, Mr. Harris here needs assignment. I believe you mentioned needing assistance with your therapy routine. Ramirez looked up, recognizing Jason from previous days. Harris, thought you'd be gone after your dad's dramatic exit from the campaign trail. Jason shifted uncomfortably. I still have hours to complete. Voluntary return, Barnes repeated, emphasizing the point to Ramirez. I'll leave him in your capable hands, Lieutenant. As Barnes departed, Ramirez gestured to the exercise equipment. I need a spotter. Burn scar tissue limits mobility. Makes some exercises impossible without assistance. Jason nodded, moving to help. For the next hour, he supported Ramirez through a grueling therapy session, witnessing firsthand the determination required to rebuild strength in damaged tissue. The lieutenant rarely spoke except to provide instruction, but his focus never wavered despite obvious pain. Why do you push this hard? Jason finally asked during a water break. The doctor said you'd never regain full mobility, right? Ramirez studied him. They did, and they're probably right. So why keep trying? Because limits are often perceptions, not realities. Ramirez rotated his scarred arm, demonstrating increased range compared to his medical prognosis. And because improvement isn't always about complete recovery, sometimes it's about refusing to accept unnecessary limitations. Jason considered this perspective so different from his father's binary view of winners and losers. Like Sarah Sullivan, applying to West Point despite her wheelchair. Exactly like that, Ramirez confirmed. She understands something most able-bodied people never learn. That physical limitations don't define your contribution potential. I never thought about it that way, Jason admitted. Few do until forced to, Ramirez replied. Now help me with these resistance bands. My left side needs extra work today. As they continued, Jason found himself fully engaged in the process, no longer watching the clock or resenting the obligation. There was something fundamentally satisfying about helping someone fight through legitimate limitations rather than exploiting perceived weaknesses. By late afternoon, Sarah Sullivan arrived for her chess strategy class. She paused upon seeing Jason working with Ramirez, surprise evident in her expression. Harris, she acknowledged cautiously, wheeling closer. Didn't expect to see you here today. Jason set down the equipment he was organizing. Your father gave me a ride. Sarah's eyebrows rose, voluntarily on both sides. Apparently, she studied him with the same analytical gaze she brought to chess strategies. Why? Jason considered the question, searching for an honest answer. Because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't watching my father's disgrace on television. And because maybe I'm tired of being exactly who he raised me to be. Sarah nodded slowly. Growth is painful, necessary but painful. Speaking from experience, Jason asked. 2 years of physical therapy after the accident taught me about necessary pain. She gestured to her wheelchair. This taught me about adapting rather than surrendering. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, years of animosity not easily dismissed despite changed circumstances. I'm sorry, Jason finally said. Not because my father got caught or because I'm required to apologize. I'm sorry because what I did to you was wrong, period. Sarah regarded him steadily. Actions matter more than words, even sincere ones. I know, Jason acknowledged. That's why I'm here. She nodded, then gestured toward her waiting chess students. I need to start class, but if you want to learn strategic thinking that doesn't involve bullying the vulnerable, you're welcome to join. Might be useful given your current situation. The offer surprised him. Not forgiveness, but opportunity. A chance to learn rather than be punished. Jason glanced at Ramirez, who gave an encouraging nod. Go, the lieutenant advised. Sullivan teaches chess the way special forces teach tactics. You'll need those skills navigating life after today. Jason followed Sarah to the recreation area, taking an open seat at the chess table. Veterans of various ages and disabilities acknowledged him with nods of varying warmth. His presence was tolerated, not yet welcome. Today, we're discussing sacrifice strategy. Sarah began setting up the demonstration board. When to give up a valuable piece for positional advantage. When apparent loss creates ultimate victory. As she proceeded with the lesson, Jason found himself fully engaged. The principles she taught applied far beyond the chessboard. Strategic thinking, long-term planning, understanding that temporary setbacks could enable greater victories. Concepts his father had never taught him, focused as he was on immediate dominance and intimidation. Across the room, Sullivan observed the scene with measured satisfaction. Not triumph over Richard Harris, but cautious hope for his son. The boy had made the harder choice today, rejecting the easy path of inherited privilege and resentment. Whether that choice would endure remained uncertain, but the potential for transformation existed. Sullivan's phone vibrated with a text from Sheriff Martinez. FBI searching Harris residence with expanded warrant. Financial records seized. Multiple charges pending. Justice was proceeding as it should have 12 years earlier. Richard Harris would face consequences for his actions past and present. The system Sullivan had defended throughout his military career was functioning correctly, if belatedly. More important than Harris's downfall, however, was Sarah's unfolding future. Sullivan watched as she commanded respect in her wheelchair, intelligence, and character, transcending physical limitations. West Point would be fortunate to have her, regardless of accommodation requirements. As Sarah's chess class concluded, Sullivan approached. Time to head home. Long day. Sarah nodded, then turned to Jason. You did well for a beginner. Strategic thinking takes practice, especially when emotionally invested in the outcome. Thanks, Jason replied awkwardly, for letting me join. Everyone deserves a chance to learn. She glanced at her father. Even those who start as opponents. Sullivan addressed Jason. Your mother called. She's returning tonight. I've arranged for Sheriff Martinez to provide escort through the media presence. Jason looked surprised. You helped my mother after everything my father did. Your mother isn't your father, Sullivan pointed out. Just as you aren't. Individual accountability matters. The concept seemed to resonate with Jason. What happens now with my father, I mean? Justice, Sullivan replied simply. Not revenge, not persecution, just appropriate consequences for actions freely chosen. And what about me? Jason asked, vulnerability briefly visible beneath the question. Community service, aside what happens to me. Sullivan considered the young man. 17, his foundation crumbling, identity in crisis. That depends entirely on your choices moving forward. Your father's path led here. Yours remains unwritten. Jason nodded slowly. I'd like to keep coming, to complete the hours, even if the court vacates the requirement. Then we'll see you tomorrow, Sullivan replied, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply acknowledging the choice as valid. As they prepared to depart, Director Barnes approached. Sullivan Harris, a moment please. He handed Jason a folder. Your official community service documentation. Signed and witnessed. 6 hours completed today. Jason accepted the folder, surprised by the formal recognition. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Barnes replied gruffly. You've got 194 hours remaining. But you made a start, under difficult circumstances. That's noted in the file. Sullivan recognized what Barnes was doing, creating official acknowledgement of Jason's voluntary return, documentation that might prove valuable in whatever legal proceedings followed his father's arrest. Lieutenant Ramirez requested you specifically for tomorrow's session, Barnes continued. 0900 hours. Don't be late. I won't, Jason promised. As Jason headed toward the exit where Martinez waited to escort him home, Sarah watched thoughtfully. Remarkable turnaround. Is it genuine? Sullivan shrugged slightly. Time will tell. Crisis reveals character more than it creates it. And Richard Harris, is this finally over? Sullivan helped Sarah navigate her wheelchair toward the exit. The legal consequences are just beginning. But our part, yes, I believe it's complete. 12 years, Sarah mused. You waited 12 years for justice. Some missions require patience, Sullivan replied, and some wounds need closure before they can heal, she added perceptively. Sullivan nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his daughter's observation. The ghosts of Baghdad might finally find rest not through revenge, but through justice properly administered. The three soldiers who had died in the ambush would never return, but the man responsible for their deaths would finally face accountability. As they drove home through the Georgia twilight, Sullivan felt a weight lifting. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but substantially. Richard Harris would face investigation, prosecution, and judgment. Jason Harris was showing signs of potential redemption. Most importantly, Sarah was safe, her future secure, despite Harris's attempts to derail it. The cabin appeared ahead, security lights activating as they approached. Home, sanctuary. The place where Sullivan had raised his daughter alone after Kate's death, creating structure and safety around her development into the remarkable young woman beside him. 2 weeks until the West Point interview committee arrives, Sarah noted as they entered. Think today's events will affect their decision. Positively, if anything, Sullivan assured her. You demonstrated integrity and resilience under extraordinary circumstances. Those qualities matter more to West Point than walking. Sarah wheeled toward her bedroom. I have that engineering project to finish, and apparently a chess strategy guide to write since Sergeant Phillips requested formal documentation of my teaching methods. Sullivan smiled slightly. Always the mission planner. I learned from the best, she replied before disappearing down the hallway. Alone in the living room, Sullivan poured a rare glass of bourbon, raising it silently toward the photograph of Kate on the mantel. Their daughter was thriving despite every obstacle. The man who had threatened her future was facing justice. The mission was complete. For the first time in 12 years, Colonel Michael Sullivan allowed himself to stand down from combat readiness. Not permanently, never completely, but substantially. The war that had followed him home from Baghdad had finally reached its proper conclusion. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Richard Harris's legal proceedings, Jason's continuing evolution, Sarah's West Point preparation. Life would proceed as it always did, presenting obstacles to overcome and victories to secure. But tonight, the last warrior had completed his final battle, not with violence or vengeance, but with justice and integrity. The very values he had defended across 30 years of military service. The principles he had instilled in his daughter. The standards by which he had always judged himself, even when others escaped such accountability. Sullivan raised his glass once more, this time to the fallen comrades, whose deaths had gone unavenged for too long. Mission complete, he murmured. Rest easy. Outside night settled over Georgia. Inside, a warrior found peace. 2 years later, this parade ground at West Point shimmered under the summer sun, cadets in perfect formation awaiting the commencement ceremony. Among them, Sarah Sullivan sat in her wheelchair uniform, impeccable posture, military perfect, despite her seated position. In the audience, Colonel Michael Sullivan watched with quiet pride. 2 years of adaptation, accommodation, and relentless effort had brought Sarah to this moment. The first cadet in a wheelchair to complete the modified physical requirements while exceeding all academic expectations, already designated for a specialized intelligence role that would utilize her strategic abilities without requiring full mobility. Beside Sullivan sat Director Barnes and several veterans from the Rehabilitation Center. Lieutenant Ramirez Burns healed as much as they ever would. Sergeant Wilson, prosthetic arm upgraded to the latest model. All present to witness Sarah's achievement, which represented possibility for wounded warriors everywhere. Sullivan, the voice came from behind. Sullivan turned to find Jason Harris approaching in his Air Force Academy uniform. No longer the arrogant teenager who had targeted Sarah, but a young man who had found purpose beyond his father's shadow. Cadet Harris, Sullivan acknowledged, noting the transformation with approval. Air Force treating you well? Jason nodded. Yes, sir. Engineering program is challenging. In a good way. Sarah mentioned you were in Colorado Springs now, said your aeronautical design showed promise. She's been helping me with the mathematical models, Jason admitted. Still better at strategy than anyone I know. Sullivan nodded, unsurprised by the continued connection between the former adversaries. Both had chosen service paths that utilized their strengths while requiring them to overcome significant obstacles. Jason, the legacy of his father's disgrace. Sarah, the limitations of her wheelchair. Your mother coming today? Sullivan asked. Yes, sir. Parking the car now. Jason hesitated. And I wanted to thank you again. For that day, for the chance to choose differently. Sullivan acknowledged this with a slight nod. You made the choice, I merely provided the opportunity. Nevertheless, Jason insisted, it mattered. The commencement ceremony began drawing their attention to the stage. As the names were called, each cadet standing to receive their commission, a special accommodation was made for Sarah. The stage had been fitted with a ramp, allowing her to wheel forward independently to accept her officer's bars. Second Lieutenant Sarah Sullivan, United States Army Military Intelligence Course. The announcement came. Sullivan stood at attention as his daughter received her commission, military bearing perfect, despite the emotion of the moment. Kate would have been so proud. The little girl they had raised together had become an extraordinary woman. Her physical limitations irrelevant compared to her character and capabilities. After the ceremony, Sarah navigated through the crowd toward her father, new lieutenant's bars gleaming on her uniform. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," Sullivan said formally, rendering a perfect salute. Sarah returned it with equal precision. "Thank you, Colonel." Then formality gave way to emotion as Sullivan embraced his daughter, 30 years of military discipline, momentarily set aside for paternal pride. "Mom would have loved this," Sarah said quietly. "She sees it," Sullivan assured her, "and approves." As they moved toward the reception, Sarah was greeted by her fellow graduates with genuine respect. No pity, no condescension, just acknowledgement of an officer who had earned her place despite unique challenges. Jason approached with his mother, Barbara Harris, who had weathered her husband's disgrace with unexpected resilience. Richard himself remained in federal prison, convicted on multiple counts of treason, fraud, and attempted vehicular homicide. His Senate aspirations replaced by a 20-year sentence. "Lieutenant Sullivan," Jason greeted Sarah formally before breaking into a smile, "beat me to commission by 3 weeks." "Army efficiency," Sarah replied with matching humor, "always ahead of Air Force bureaucracy." Sullivan observed their interaction with satisfaction. Adversaries transformed into allies through crisis and choice. The future of military leadership standing before him forged through challenge rather than privilege. As the celebration continued, Sullivan found a moment of quiet reflection. 30 years of service, combat zones across 4 continents, medals and citations documenting valor under fire. But nothing in his distinguished military career had required more strategic patience, tactical precision, and moral courage than the battle fought on home soil for his daughter's future. The last warrior had completed his final mission. Not on a foreign battlefield, but in the halls of justice, in the crucible of character development. Sarah would carry forward his legacy of integrity and service not through genetics, but through values demonstrated and embraced. And that Sullivan realized as he watched his daughter, among her fellow officers, represented the most meaningful victory of his life. Not defeating Richard Harris, but raising Sarah to overcome every obstacle placed before her. Not physical combat prowess, but the strength of character that transcended physical limitations. The sun began to set over the Hudson River, painting West Point in golden light. One generation of military service concluding another beginning. The eternal cycle of duty honor country, continuing through new guardians facing new challenges. For Colonel Michael Sullivan, the last warrior had found his peace, not in victory over enemies, but in the enduring legacy of a daughter who embodied everything worth fighting for. Mission complete.